All right. That's great. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I am Leanne. I am on the continuing education team at Longwood Gardens. Just want to give you a quick welcome, say thank you for joining us, and that tonight's session is recorded. So if you lose internet connection or if you are unable to stay through the entire talk, then we will be sending this out in our thank you email afterwards. That'll come a day or two after the class once we process and cut out the beginning chatter and all that. But that will come in our thank you email, and you'll be able to watch that at your leisure. And if you want to revisit any of the information that Barb goes over. So we will take questions at the end. Hopefully we'll have enough time, and there will be a chance for Barb to, we'll go through the chat. So if you want to, if a question pops up and you want to have it saved, you can feel free to put that in the chat and I will read them out at the end. And otherwise, then we may have some time for unmuting and asking Barb some questions directly at the end as well. So this will be a lecture for about 1 hour, and then we'll get to ask some questions. So tonight our talk is being led by Barb Schmidt. She is the Vice President of the American Orchid Society and the chair of the education department there. So we are in for a treat and a great depth of knowledge because since she's been raising orchids for over 20 years. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Barb.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining me. This is a perfect time. I really February it's nice to at least sit inside in the warmth and look at warm things or look at nice flowers, I should say. Let me share and get my screen going here for you. So as Leanne mentioned, I've been raising orchids for about 20 years and absolutely love them. They're very addicting. I always warn people that once you start getting interested in orchids, it kind of drags you down this rabbit hole that you never get out of. Uh, and pretty much everyone that I know killed their first orchid, myself included. So if that's happened to you, it doesn't mean that you're not going to end up with orchids filling your house 20 years from now, like I have. So thank you again so much. Tonight's talk is just kind of a very fun, relaxing talk called An Introduction to Everything Orchids. Um, the way I want to start, most people don't quite understand the depth of evolution that orchids have. They actually started in the Cretaceous period, which roughly scientists now think about 112 to 120 million years ago. And I have to explain my cute little picture there. I went to Copilot and asked for help to get create a picture for me that would generate the sense of being in under the canopy during the Cretaceous period. It threw the dinosaurs in on its own. I didn't ask for that. I was just sort of asking for conditions that might have occurred at that time. But the point that I'm trying to get here is these are very, very old plants that have some are still extant, and extant means they are still living. The genus still exists in today. You can go see this. But at the time orchids evolved or arose, it was a very wet, very humid and misty climate. There was a lot of vegetation up until the flowering plants arose. Everything else had been like large tree ferns and bromeliads and those types of vegetation. And somewhere in this period, angiosperms evolved and orchidaceae came into being. The interesting thing about the climate during the late Cretaceous period was that it was a constant temperature. So day, night, there was no four seasons or anything. It was just all hot, humid, and in actually ideal conditions for most of the epiphytic orchids that we see today. The other interesting thing is scientists have now decided that orchids probably arose somewhere in the South China, North Australia area, but keep in mind Pangea was just starting to break apart when this evolution occurred or when these came into being. So those two things weren't that far apart at that time. If you notice on the screen, India's way down here yet. India has not even hit the continent up to create the Himalaya mountains. So this, and they get this just because of the types of orchids that are still in those locations is where they came up with this idea. And then they spread out from that small location. Um, they're saying right now that they believe it's about 112 to 120 million years ago. And how they found that out started off by sheer accident because orchids don't fossilize. There's no bone there like a dinosaur. Most plants don't. The only thing that we maybe get is if you find a fern caught in shale. You might find a piece of shale that has a fern in it. But for the most part, you can't find fossils of plants. And the way they found this out is in the mid 80s, scientists were actually looking at amber. They were dating very old pieces of amber, and they had one that was about 35 million years old. And when they took out the amber, there was a sting, or opened up the amber, there was a stingless bee inside. On the back of the stingless bee was orchid pollen, at perfectly preserved orchid pollen that looked exactly like orchid pollen that we see today. And this told them two things. First, stingless bees were pollinators of orchids. And second, orchids were way older than they ever expected. So they started looking for older and older pieces of amber and got it back to maybe about 65 or 80 million years ago. But there's an interesting process called a molecular clock. And once DNA testing became more commonplace, what scientists discovered is there's certain genes in us, but also in plants, that mutate at a very regular, consistent schedule. So what they do is they find modern orchids and they took the DNA out of the pollen that they found at various times in the past, and they counted how many mutations there were. And they can tell how old the very first one was based on how long it's been and how many mutations we have now. So they back calculated and have now come up with that it's somewhere in the mid Cretaceous, like 112 to 120. And the Apostasia orchid there is one of those extant orchids. This is one of the first orchids to arise in Orchidaceae. It's a grass orchid, and it still grows in Australia and southern China. So that was one of the cues that told them that this must have been the seat of where this all began, because this very old orchid is still growing there. So it's kind of interesting when you think about the fact that there are orchids that have been here for 80 some million years, the same genus, and you could go look at them. This gives you just a basic idea of how Orchidaceae evolved. So that Apostasia orchid, first one that they came up with. Second one that they think appeared was the vanilla orchid. And then it about 20 million or 10 million years later, all of the lady slipper orchids. Now those are terrestrial orchids. And they're thinking that that's when they all are there. They know that's when they all came out. And then what is doesn't show on here is between 70 million and 60 million years ago is when the comet hit the Earth. and took out 75% of life on Earth. Did not take out the orchids. What it did for the orchids, though, is it opened up niches that had not existed before, because remember I said that, like, that it was just filled with vegetation. So there was a lot of competition for places to grow. When that comet took out all 75% of life, it opened up a lot of places for the remaining life to move into. So 60 million years ago, we started having a bigger diversity of orchids show up. And some of these, the spiranthes and the platanthera, they actually, they're at Longwood. You can see those in the spring. I do a class in May called a native orchid walk, and we walk around Longwood and take a look at some native orchids. And platanthera and spiranthes are two of the ones that you can see there. They're terrestrial orchids in temperate climates. Um, and then if you look at 35 million years ago, 80% of all orchids appeared 30%, 35 million years ago. That was the second major step that happened in orchids, and that's when orchids became epiphytic. And epiphytic means they grow on the outside of a tree. So rather than competing with everything else on the ground and growing in the ground, these orchids moved up into the trees, not literally, but they started growing in trees. And again, they had no competition up in the trees, and they just exploded in diversity. The reason scientists believe that orchids became epiphytic is because orchids produce naked seeds. And naked seeds mean there is no endosperm. So the seeds are the size of a dust particle. And when a seed pod of an orchid bursts open, it's like blowing something out of your vacuum cleaner. There's just dust goes everywhere. And what scientists believe is that the climate roughly 35 million years ago was such that when these seeds hit the trees, some of them were able to take a hold in the trees and start growing up in the canopy. And that just opened up a whole new world for orchids. And all of the common ones that we're more familiar with, the Phalaenopsis, Cattleya, Dendrobium, Oncidiums, they all took off, like growing in the canopies. I want to come back to the vanilla genus just for a minute, because a lot of people don't recognize that your vanilla extract comes from an orchid. The vanilla orchid is native to Mesoamerica, and ironically is pollinated by the stingless bee. The problem is that the stingless bee is going extinct in Mesoamerica. So massive plantations have been created in places like Sri Lanka and Madagascar and India. So if you ever pick up vanilla extract and it said from Madagascar, that's why. Now, unfortunately, at any of those locations, there's no pollinators for these orchids. So a person has to hand pollinate all of those flowers, which even that wouldn't be too bad, except this type of an orchid is a sequential flowering orchid, meaning it'll flower one flower a day. So what you have in these plantations are workers that are out there 365 days out of the year hand pollinating these orchids. And they will eventually produce a seed pod, which is a vanilla bean. The seed pod will look like a large green bean, and it takes them about 10 months to process it. And it will process down to a whole vanilla bean. So if you've ever bought a vanilla bean, that's actually the seed pod of the vanilla orchid. And if you open it, next time you get one, open it up and you'll see a whole bunch of teeny tiny little specks on the inside. That's actually the seeds. That actually would have been the seeds of that vanilla orchid. So that's why vanilla extract is so expensive, because it is hugely labor intensive. It's all by hand. And then you go back out and you pick these beans by hand. And then it takes about 12 months to 18 months to turn those beans into the little extract that you buy in the bottle. So that's why it's second only to saffron as the most expensive spice. The other thing that happened when orchids had all this time to evolve is, if you remember on that map, they were spreading out through Africa and South America and up around into Europe. They eventually spread to every continent on the planet except Antarctica. They can grow in any, there's types of orchids that can grow in any climate except one that is permanently frozen or permanently dry. So there's this adorable little tiny sparrow's egg lady slipper that grows above the Arctic Circle. And it has about 6 to 8 weeks of growth time. And it just pops up, makes this adorable little flower, pollinates it, spreads its seeds, and then goes dormant until the next spring. And there's also one in the Cape of Africa, that golden satyr orchid, that is laying or growing out in the middle of an African prairie land at about 112 degrees and full sun. So they have really adapted to many conditions completely around the world. And it's fun to go look for native orchids, which is why we started the walk down at Longwood, because it's just really interesting to see how these orchids grow. Orchids are actually perennial herbs, and that's a botanical term, which means they grow more than 1 year, and an herb means they don't have a woody structure. So these series of pictures were taken up in Ithaca, New York. My daughter and I were hiking up there one spring, and I saw the leaves on the left, the far left picture, and recognized what it was. Now, she was going to school up there at the time, so I had her go back on the hike once a week so she could finally get me the pictures of the bud coming out and the Acali orchid opening. So that Cypripedium acali grows like any other perennial that's it's sitting next to. It will go dormant all winter. Sometime in April or May, it will start growing. Midsummer, it's going to put out this beautiful pink. It's a type of a lady slipper, so it'll put out this beautiful pink bloom and then goes dormant again in September. Acalis, this Cypripedium is native to the eastern third of the United States. So any hiking anywhere up and down the eastern third of the United States, you can find these Acalis. My daughter and I were also hiking in Hickory Run State Park. I live in Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania. And we saw a huge clump of them growing in a decaying tree. The unique thing about this orchid is it wants a soil pH of about 4.5. So very low soil. If you kind of notice in the background behind the flower, that's a pine tree. And they often grow under pine trees because the tannic acid will keep the soil nice and low in pH. It also cuts down the competition for them because there aren't a lot of plants that can grow in that at that low of a pH. So how do we know what's an orchid? How do we identify an orchid flower? All orchids are going to have three sepals and three petals. And one of the petals is going to be modified into a labellum, or we sometimes call it a lip. A sepal is if you look at a bud of a plant, the sepal is the plant structure that you're seeing on the outside. It has two purposes. One is to protect the bud, and the second purpose is after the flower opens, the sepal sits under the bottom and kind of props up the flower and makes it more available for the pollinators. So a lot of plants, you can easily pick out the sepals because the sepals are usually not colored. They're in roses, for example, they're the kind of off-white rough things that end up at the bottom of the rose when it opens. Orchids aren't like that. They don't waste energy at all, and I'm guessing it's part of that evolutionary process. So if you look at these orchids here, the sepals are colored and patterned exactly like the petals. In some orchids, it's not at all easy to determine where the sepal or the petals are. But the reason I put this up is just because it has three petals, two or three sepals, two petals, and one labellum doesn't mean that it looks at all alike, because each one of these orchids is looking for a different type of a pollinator. That was another thing that orchids evolved to, where different orchids have different pollinators. It's not like that in all the different types of plants. For example, if you've got different types of roses, most rose bushes are going to be pollinated by the same thing, regardless of the species of the rose bush. Not so, or the genus of the rose bush, not so for orchids. They are looking for totally different pollinators, and that drives them to have taken those six things that make up an orchid and make them look different. Another unique factor about orchids is their floral symmetry. Most flowers are actinomorphic, which means they have radial symmetry. So if you think of the perennials, like that zinnia was just I grew in my garden 2 years ago. Zinnias, roses, sunflowers, daisies, they all have that radial symmetry. Orchids are not. They're zygomorphic, which means they have bilateral symmetry. And if you, on that cattleya there, you can almost see the fold line in the middle where you fold that plant, that flower in half, and it's going to match exactly. And I read a very interesting article by a psychologist about 2 years ago, when the in 19 or in I'm sorry 2014, the orchids overtook poinsettias as the most popular indoor plant, and I don't think they've ever given it up since then. Well, this psychologist wanted to know, what was this current orchid craze? Why did everybody want to buy orchids and raise orchids? And his theory is that our faces are bilateral symmetry, and our brains are hardwired to be attracted to things that have bilateral symmetry. So I like to tell the people in my classes, it's not really your fault that you're out buying all these orchids. It's because your brain wants you to have those, because it has the same symmetry as your face. So that's always an excuse to use if there's another orchid that you'd like to add to your collection. But even though we have these two things, this is what orchids did, and this is only a few of the genera, but this is what they did with those three sepals, three petals, and bilateral symmetry. Um, don't look alike at all. There's even orchids in the same genus that don't look alike. Take a look at the top right, the two on the right. They're both cymbidiums, but they don't look anything alike. Um, if you go straight down the right column, those are two phalaenopsis, the Violacea and the Baldwin's kaleidoscope. Again, not close enough maybe, but they don't look the same, because they're each one of those is looking for a different pollinator. So its color, its shape, its size, its scent is patterning is totally dependent on the pollinator, and those pollinators can be as small as a fungus gnat or as large as a bat. So it's amazing. The other thing they do, remember I said they don't waste energy? This Brassolalia cattleya up here, this Prada green, I love green flowers. My daughter thinks I'm nuts, but I absolutely love green flowers. And that cattleya had a beautiful scent to it at 2 in the morning, because it's looking for a night moth. And if you look at the color, think about the moon reflecting off that. So it doesn't have the patterning, it doesn't have the pretty stripes. You're not going to see those at night. What it has is a color that when the moon hits that, that'll look like a little beacon that the night moth will be able to see. So again, it's not wasting the energy on the pretty if its pollinator doesn't need the pretty. And the scent it has, it's a gorgeous scent. The scent draws it in then when the pollinator gets close enough. Um, Next, I just want to go over a little bit the names for orchids, the names of how they grow. The Greeks did a lot on that, which is why they're not as easy to pronounce. In my last class last night, people said to me, "I just wish the names were easier to pronounce." It again, the Greeks named a lot of these, and monopodial orchids literally mean 1 foot. So there's a group of orchids that have a single stem, and Phalaenopsis is one of them. So that's the one that all the big box stores carry. And this is a Phalaenopsis that I had, and it will grow straight up. Phalaenopsis orchids or monopodial orchids will have a single stem. Their leaves will alternate in sides when they come out. All the new growth comes out of the top. The leaves will come out, or the roots will come out off that same stem, as will the bud stems come up from that stem. So that type of an orchid will probably not need to be repotted too often because it's going to grow up. It's only when it gets too top heavy and starts falling out of the pot. And I do have a repotting demonstration at the end, and that's kind of what happened to mine. They just tipped over because the plant got too big. I do want to point something out on this slide, and it's this root cross section in the bottom right corner of the diagram that I have. When you look at an orchid root, what you're seeing is a substance called velamen. And velamen is a sponge-like substance. The actual root of that orchid is about the thickness of a fishing line that runs down the center of it. And it's coated by this sponge coating. Again, this is an evolutionary trait that this orchid developed. These are epiphytic orchids. So in nature, hanging off a tree. You never know when the next rainstorm's coming. So rainstorm comes through, the sponge coating absorbs the water and then very slowly releases it to the root that's on the inside. This is what causes the vast majority of people to kill their orchids, because we think these types of orchids need to be watered more frequently, and they don't, because they've got that little sponge coating. And if you think of what would happen if you took a kitchen sponge and put it in a pot and covered it in water, it'd take it about 2 weeks for that sponge to decay and fall apart. That's what happens to the orchid roots. When they sit in water for any length of time, they start decaying, and then the plant rots from the bottom up and eventually dies. I know that's how I killed my first one. I just kept watering it like I watered any of my other house plants. There's a second type of orchid growth, and there's no advantage one over the other. It's just the way they evolved. And that's called sympodial, which means many feet. These grow, if you've ever raised bearded irises, these grow off of a rhizome that's laying horizontal in the media. So the rhizome just continues to grow out in the media, and every spring it pokes up new shoots off that rhizome. This one is an oncidium that it tends to grow out. Some of them, like cattleyas, will grow in a straight line. It'll start on one end of your pot and just grow straight across the pot. And each spring it puts up one shoot, and all of the flowers come off of the new shoots, not the old ones. So once a shoot is flowered, it won't flower again. The other thing I want to point out on here is some orchids have what's called pseudobulbs, sort of look like little tulip bulbs at the bottom. Some of them are round, some of them are pear-shaped like this one. Others are just long, tall type bulbs. They're a storage structure. So what the orchid has done, again, it's evolved to save water and nutrients. It stores them in these little pseudobulbs. So even if you're not getting any more flowers off of that pseudobulb, it's benefiting the plant because it's a food and water storage for it. And then the two main ways that orchids will grow in nature, as I mentioned, is epiphytic or lithophytic means they grow on a rock. So epiphytic or lithophytic, or they're terrestrial. And the examples here, lady slipper orchids or those cypripediums that I showed you, the acai, those are the classic terrestrial orchids. And this is actually the Phalaenopsis that's there is actually one that I bought at a Lowe's and just brought it home, took it out of the pot and attached it to a piece of cork bark. So you could see what an orchid, that's how that orchid would grow in nature. It would just be attached onto a tree like that, um, probably growing upside down, not that way, because the weight of the orchid would cause the growth to come down. So if you were to go and find this growing in a jungle, it would probably be flipped with the leaves coming downward off of it. But that's how they grow in nature. That's how they evolve to grow. And it's using those thick leaves and the many roots with the velamen on it to store its water and nutrients. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit, move into talking about caring for an orchid. And again, I just want to reinforce these are perennial herbs. We don't think of them that way because the ones that we bring home are semi-tropical or subtropical or tropical orchids, and we put them on our table and we give them ideal growth conditions, and they don't really need to go into a rest phase. This is a hardy orchid I have growing outside. It grows like my ferns, my daisies, anything that I have out there. It will, if you look at the rest phase, that's kind of where it is now, except in my case, it's buried under 1.5 feet of snow, but it's underground. It will be there until April. And then you can see some tiny little green coming out there on this one. And it'll just start popping up as soon as the ground thaws. And then eventually I get these beautiful knee-high leaves that are sort of pleated. And sometime in July, August, it puts out a very tall bud stem with fluorescent pink flowers in them. So this is something that if you hardy orchids are just, or native orchids are really a fun way to expand your orchid collection if you have the outdoor space to put them in. And you just need to make sure you're buying, that's a case of where you buy the orchid to the conditions you have. I would love to grow that Cypripedium acai. I can't give it a pH of 4.5. I don't have any location like that that would work for it. So I'm growing ones that I know can grow in the area, the type of soil that I have. So orchids will go through a growth phase. This is the longest and the most important phase that it's going to have. In our, and by our, I mean United States, in the latitude of the United States, its growth phase is going to be April to September, roughly. This is when all of its new roots and shoots and leaves will appear. This is also when it will make all of the sugars it needs for plant growth and flowering. So below it is the photosynthesis reaction. And photosynthesis is just water and air around it. But the driving force is the sunlight. If you don't have the right sunlight, if you're not giving your orchid the correct sunlight, it can't make enough sugar. It's going to make this one little pot of sugar, and then it's going to divide it out between plant growth and blooms, but it's preferentially going to go to plant growth because its first goal is to keep itself alive. So if you have an orchid that has not bloomed for many years, one of the reasons could be that it's not getting the correct amount of sunlight. It needs that sunlight to make enough sugar to bloom. And then after it goes through its growth phase, it will bloom. And some of those blooms will be one night, like that vanilla orchid that I mentioned, to some of the hybrid Phalaenopsis now are 4 to 6 months or longer. I had somebody tell me they had one bloom continuously for a year. It just kept putting out new bud spikes and continued to bloom. And that's what they're hybridizing those for. They're hybridizing them to actually produce bigger blooms, longer lasting blooms, and longer blooming cycles. Blooming generally will initiate and happen sometime between September and April. In most orchids, I will qualify most orchids. If you own a Laelia orchid, Laelias are from South America, they bloom in July. So if you happen to have bought a Laelia or an orchid that has a Laelia in its heritage, basically, you may find that orchid blooms in the summer, not the winter. But in our latitudes, almost all the orchids will initiate their blooming cycle in September or October, and the blooms will all appear January, February, March, and April, which is why that's when all the major orchid shows are. The Philadelphia Flower Show's the beginning of March. U.S. Botanic Gardens is I think it's January to April. New York Botanic Gardens is January to March. Even Santa Barbara, spoke out at the Santa Barbara show, and theirs is February, March, and April, somewhere in there. So that's why all of the major orchid shows occur that time of year, because that's when all of the orchids are naturally wanting to bloom during that time frame. And your terrestrial or your tropical or subtropical orchids will actually take a rest period, and you may not ever notice it. The ones that the hardy orchid, my hardy orchid growing outside, its rest period is when it's dormant over the winter, and then it starts growing again. It's not as obvious on when a rest period occurs for the tropical and subtropical ones. Usually what happens sometime around late March to April, you'll notice your orchid's not doing anything. It's not making new roots. It's not growing new bud spikes. It's not growing new leaves. Now, if it's a phalaenopsis and it has blooms, it'll probably keep its blooms, but it's not making new ones. And that's kind of it doing its rest phase. So light requirements and again, I want to qualify and say that I'm talking about orchids that you would take into your house and grow. Like I mentioned, that Seder orchid growing at 112 degrees and in the middle of equatorial sun. Commercial growers realized we can't replicate those conditions in our houses. So if they want to sell orchids to us, they have to sell the genera that will grow in a house easily. And that's what I mean when I say orchids like bright light, but not a lot of direct light. And most of them will not want midday direct light. Some of them will like early morning or late afternoon, but most of them don't want that south exposure midday sun because that genus just isn't used to that level of radiant energy. It's really important that you make sure your orchid's getting the right amount of light for its genus. Um, that will dictate how healthy the plant's going to be and how much it's going to bloom. Without that light, it can't photosynthesize enough carbohydrates. So if you buy a new orchid, a Phalaenopsis orchid is kind of a medium to low light orchid. Does very well in the house. That's why it's so popular. You can put it by a window. East or west facing windows are perfect for a Phalaenopsis. I have a north facing bow window that gets a little bit of direct sun, and mine are also happy in there. So you need to figure out where it's but it doesn't need a whole lot of sun. But if you go to an orchid show, say, and decide to get a new genus, you can't assume it's going to need the same amount of sun as your Phalaenopsis that you have. So the first thing you need to do is figure out how much sun it needs. And at the very end, I have some resources for you that'll help you if you decide to branch out and get a different type of an orchid, different genus. Now, the nice thing about orchids, is they will tell you if they're getting too much or too little light. When you buy an orchid, make a mental note of what color green the leaves are. If it's not getting enough light, the plant's going to try to compensate for that. So it's going to start making extra chlorophyll, and it's going to throw that chlorophyll into the leaves. Chlorophyll is green in color, and those your leaves will get a darker green. So if you bring home a plant that's like a medium yellow green, and in about a month you notice it's suddenly this deep, deep green, it's the plant telling you, I need more sun. And if it doesn't have enough sun, it can't make enough sugar to grow and bloom, and most likely it just won't bloom. It'll grow for you, but you're not going to get it to bloom. Conversely, the other thing happens if you're giving it too much light. If you put a plant like a phalaenopsis, for example, you take it to a south-facing window and you set it down, now it's getting way more light than it can handle. And what plants do is if there's excess radiant energy, it gets dissipated as heat, and you can actually scorch the leaves. So the first thing the plant will do is get rid of a lot of chlorophyll. So now the leaves go from green to this yellow green. And then if you still don't take it away from it, the leaves will start scorching. The edges of them can turn red. They almost look like they're sunburning, or you can get dry patches in the leaf where it's scorched and dried out and died. So if you watch the color of your orchid leaves, it will tell you if it's getting the right amount of light or not the right amount of light. It's not nearly as helpful with watering, telling you whether it's too much water or too little water. So in either case, your orchid leaf is going to wrinkle and become very flaccid. It'll be like floppy. So rather than having these nice upright leaves, they get all wrinkled and they just kind of hang down. The reason this is happening is because if you're overwatering your plant, the roots rot and die. If you're underwatering the plant, the roots dry out and die. But the and die is the important thing. And as the roots die, the plant can't take in water anymore, either in either case. So the leaves shrivel, and then eventually the plant dies because it's not getting, it's either overwatered or underwatered. The only way you can figure out which way it is to take the orchid out of the pot. You have to you have to take it out of the pot, take a look at the roots. The roots are all black and mushy. They've been overwatered. So you throw away the potting media, you rinse the roots off in warm water and get all the decay off them, and then replant in new media and water it less frequently. If you take them out and they're just a mass of shriveled little dry roots, you're underwatering. So again, you don't really have to clean the media up that much because it's usually nothing there except the dried roots, but you need to increase how often you're watering. A quick tip on how to know when to water is by either I use those skinny skewers that you can make food on a grill with, wooden skewers, and just very gently put the skewer down close to the center of your orchid and pull it back out. And if the bottom of the wood is wet, you don't need to water yet. If the bottom of the wood is dry, then it's time to water. And if nothing changes in the conditions in your house and you figure out that your Phalaenopsis orchid is taking 5 days to dry out, it will always take 5 days. You don't have to keep doing this stick thing every time, but it's a great way to figure out if you buy a new orchid, how long it's going to take that orchid to dry out in your house. And then you know how often to water it and you're not over watering or under watering. Just some tips here. When orchids are growing or when they're making plant material, they will use the process of respiration, similar to what we use when we are building new cells. Respiration needs water. So you may notice that when your orchid starts blooming, the more blooms it puts out, it's actually drying out faster. So that's a time when you may have to start checking again with your little skewer. If your orchid starts putting out blooms, then watch that it's not drying out faster because it's using that water to produce the blooms. And you may need to shorten your water and water it more frequently. As I mentioned, just keep thinking of that kitchen sponge things. Orchid roots do not like sitting in water. One of the things that happens is they sell these orchids in these beautiful ceramic pots that don't have a drain hole. And they actually end up being a death knell for the orchid that's in it if you water it in the pot. Because you pour the water in the pot, it can't come out of the ceramic, and you end up with an inch or two of water sitting at the bottom of that ceramic pot that the orchid roots at the bottom are just constantly sitting in water. So you want to take the plastic pot out of the ceramic pot, water the plastic pot, let that drip off, and then put it back in the pretty pot. There's only two things with worrying about whether you can use water from your house. If you have chlorinated water, you can still use it, but you need to pour it out into a big bowl at night and the chlorine will off gas. And then you can use that water the next day to water the orchids, but you don't want to water it with chlorinated water because the chlorine will build up and burn the roots. If you have a whole house water softener, that's going to be a problem because water softeners put salts into the water. And if you continuously water your orchids with that salty water, the salt will build up in the media and burn the roots. So if you have a whole house water softener, I would suggest either collecting rainwater or just buy spring water. You don't need reverse osmosis water. That's very expensive. Spring water works just fine if you can't use your own home water. And then anytime you're repotting your orchid, make sure you get a pot that has an orchid pot. Orchid pots have lots of holes in them. And the intent being that you're letting the water run out, you're just watering it, getting that media all full of water, letting the velamen absorb some water around the roots, but you're not letting it sit in there and let those roots soak in the water. So make sure you buy an orchid pot if you're going to transplant your orchid. Temperature requirements are way easier because pretty much if again this is a commercial grower saying we can't commercialize the plant that needs 120 degrees because nobody's going to do that in their house, so we're only going to commercialize the ones that pretty much are happy where you're happy. So if you like, my house is 72. Orchids are good between 55 and 85. So for the most part, you're good just putting it in your house. The only thing they don't like is sudden temperature changes or drafts. So you don't want to put them under like a heat register where there's stuff blowing down on it. You don't want to. I had in my class last night, I had an in-person class down at Longwood last night, and somebody wanted to bring an orchid in for me to show me. And I said, "Oh, I would not recommend that. Like it is below freezing. You can't take that thing from a 72-degree house, pop it outside at 13 degrees, and then put it in a car that's still not going to be warm enough. You'll cold shock it before it ever gets to the class." And luckily he listened. He didn't bring it in, but those are the types of things you have to watch, that they don't like sudden changes in temperature. Um, they can actually overheat, again, because the ones that have been commercialized are not the ones that like the 120 degrees. So you don't want to let it go much over 85 if you decide to put it out for the summer. Just make sure that it's not getting overheated. And all orchids like cooler nighttime temperatures because that's a jungle environment. It can be 95 in the day, but it could 65 at night. And this is what they evolved in, where it cools down at night. That's actually one of the blooming cues for a lot of orchids, is that the difference in the day-night temperature gets wider. The nighttime temperatures get colder. And humidity and nutrient requirements, most orchids don't require a lot of high humidity. If you put a lot of humidity around them, you can sometimes encourage fungal or bacterial growth. So as long as, again, if you're comfortable in your house, the orchids are going to be comfortable. They don't need 40% humidity is fine for an orchid. You don't have for most genera. There are some that want 85 and 95%, but those are the types that you're growing in a greenhouse. If you absolutely need to do extra humidity, like you've bought a dendrobium that needs that humidity, rather than spraying it with misting it with water, make a humidity tray, which is just get a saucer, fill it with stones, set the orchid on top of it. So now the orchid's not in the water, and then fill the tray with water. And as the water evaporates up around it, it'll humidify it. They do need to be fertilized. Any good orchid fertilizer will work great. The reason I say orchid fertilizer is there's micronutrients in those like magnesium and calcium that the orchids need. So without those, they will not thrive as well as if you were it like a 10-10-10 will work if you just buy that, but you really want to buy an orchid fertilizer, and there's lots of those out there. And I say here fertilize every other time you water, but they have now come out with some very good time release orchid fertilizers that are tiny little pellets, and those are great. That it's like a quarter teaspoon on your plant every 3 months, and it gives the orchid what it needs. So the last thing I'm going to do before I move into the repotting is, of course, this is what everybody wants to know. How do I get my orchid to rebloom? You buy these beautiful blooming orchids, you bring them home, and now you want to get them to bloom again. So it's really a case of two things the way you take care of it, and one is giving it its blooming cue. It has to have the right amount. I can't overemphasize that. You have to make sure you're giving it the right amount of sunlight for its genus. It's the only shot it has at making enough carbohydrates to have enough to bloom. You also need to fertilize it. It needs those micronutrients. So you don't have to fertilize it. I mean, if you miss it's a month or so, like it's not going to stop it from blooming, but it will do much better if you can remember to fertilize it, which is why I went to the little time release ones because I kept forgetting. So those are fantastic. 4 times a year. I just have to remember to put that on the orchid pot and I'm good to go. Then there are two main blooming cues that orchids are looking for. One of them is shorter daylight hours, and that's a Cattleya orchid. There are some species of Cattleya that really only need the daylight hours to be a couple minutes shorter in daylight. So not talking like a big difference, but they have to see that. They need to see that darkening in the fall for them to initiate blooming. The second one is they need not so much the cooler nighttime temperatures, but the wider difference between daytime and nighttime, which generally happens in our fall. So I could still have the 72-degree day, but I've got a 50-degree night. Now there's that wide difference between day to night. That's what a phalaenopsis needs to see. So if you grow in your home and you grow them next to a window, usually there's enough of a difference there that it can sense that change in day to night temperature lengthening or getting wider in the fall. If you happen to live someplace where you absolutely just apartments, something where you don't have, you almost have to create a place to get it cooler at night. If you have a home, you can put it in the garage. Just in the fall, like September, last 3 weeks in September, maybe first week in October, every night just carry your phalaenopsis down, put it in the garage, bring it back up at night. And just that cooler temperature in the garage will initiate it. If you don't have that, I have actually seen people that have either turned off heat or turned down heat in one room, or like got a closet where they somehow got the closet cooler and then put the orchid in there. But it can't see the same, if it sees the same constant temperature difference 12 months out of the year, it will never see its blooming cue. So very quickly, I know we're almost at 7, but I am going to answer questions and I will run through the potting demonstration. Orchids are very old. They've had like 112 million years to evolve. So they're very, I always say orchids are survivors. They're very good at surviving. You just need to figure out what your genus needs. There's native orchids everywhere, as I mentioned. That's a fun hobby. If you like to hike, find out what native orchids are in your area. And you can go out to different places and look for them. They look so completely different because of the pollinator they're trying to attract. They're actually fairly easy to grow if you understand what the genus needs. And if you also understand that those roots have a sponge on the outside of them that's helping to maintain water for them. So you just have to make sure that sponge gets a chance to dry in between watering. That's why if you ever looked at orchid media, it's not soil, it's chunks of media, and the chunks are to let air come in around those roots. Most orchid genera that you can buy are going to need bright light, not direct light. You can definitely grow them under lights if you're in an apartment and don't have the right lights. You can do LEDs or as long as you're doing grow lights. Again, the velamin, that's what's helping the orchid store water. It's also what's killing the orchid if you overwater it. That sponge just dies and starts molding. And make sure you're using that good orchid fertilizer. And they're very easy to repot. People always tell me they're afraid to repot their orchid, and there's really not a lot to repotting an orchid. It's not any more difficult than repotting another houseplant. So that's what I'm going to move into now, is we're going to talk about how do you repot an orchid. And as I'm going through this, I will try to, whoops, I'm sorry. So as you can see here, these two Phalaenopsis were just falling out of their pots. So it was time to get them repotted. You don't always have to buy a new pot. The one on the right is the one that I'm going to repot, and I'm going to reuse the pot because it just needed to be stood up and put back in a little deeper. So the first thing you would do is you would soak your bowl in water or your orchid in a bowl of water for about 15 minutes. That'll soften up those roots. It'll make the coating on those roots get ever so much softer and easier to get the orchid out. I have a terracotta pot. So what I had to do was actually take like a kitchen knife and go around the inside to get it to let go, because the same thing that holds them onto those trees will hold them onto the inside of your pot. If you've got a plastic pot, much easier. Just squeeze the sides of the pot and the orchid will come out. You do want to cover the surface you're working on because it's very messy. You can see from here, I did break off some orchid roots when I pulled it out. There's so many roots in these, or if it's a healthy orchid, it's not a problem that you've broken the roots off. So if you look at the left, that's what was in the pot when I pulled it out. I washed mine off. You don't have to wash them off, but I washed them off to make it easy for you to see what the root ball looked like. I had some shriveled dead roots, which are the dark black colored things. And any healthy root is going to be plump. Don't worry about the color. The ones underground are going to be white. The ones that see the sunshine are going to have chlorophyll in them, so they'll be green when they get wet. That's normal. I've actually seen some orchids that have red roots. So don't be so concerned about the color. What you're looking for are they dried out? Is there a lot of mush, decay in there, or just the normal amount of dead roots? Because that happens as the orchid grows, some of them die off. The picture on the left, I ask AI to really brighten it up for me. What you're seeing there in that orange oval is actually the orchid stem. As this orchid kept growing up and up and up and up, the stem at the bottom died. So what I need to do is cut part of that stem off and drop the orchid back down in the pot, which is why I can reuse the same pot. And I put that diagram back up so you can have a feel for what I'm talking about when I say the center of the stem. This is what I cut off the orchid before I repotted it. And if you look at the green arrows, they're showing you that orchid or the velamen, the dried velamen, the dead velamen. And the orange arrow there shows you that fishing line root that's on the inside of it. And at the bottom, you can see I cut off about an inch, maybe an inch and a half of the old orchid stem, and there was nothing on it but a dead root. But that gives me some ability now to drop it down into the media more. And it might look like I've cut off a lot, but that's what's left of on my orchid afterwards. And everything that there now is pretty much nice, healthy roots. I've taken away anything that can decay. Just regular garden shears will work for that. And when I'm ready to repot it, what I tend to do is I hold my hand like this with a V, and I put the orchid in here so the crown of the orchid is above my hand and the roots are dangling below my hand. And then I lay my hand on the top of the pot so I get it at the right height. And I hold it there with my non-dominant hand, and then I use my dominant hand and I just start adding media hands full at a time into that pot and pushing it down with my fingers to get it to go down through all the roots. So the roots are dangling down and I'm just putting in media and dropping it down and pushing it in to kind of firm it up. And that's all there is to it. It's really not as difficult. You're going to break roots doing this, but with the amount of roots that I had there, it only took the plant maybe about a month or two to get over the shock of being transplanted or being repotted. I would not repot an orchid that's blooming because it may be enough of a shock to make the blooms drop. So here's the resources that I mentioned. I'm going to pull up the chat window now. Oops, I'm sorry. Chat window and see what the questions are. Um, what I will mention here is the step-by-step that I just gave you on my repotting is on my website if you want to follow it again, but you're also going to have it here in this recording. If you ever need care sheets for a new genus of orchid, um, as Leanne mentioned, I'm vice president of the American Orchid Society. We offer them for free on our website. So you would just go to our website and look up care and culture sheets, and there's a lot of different genera there that will tell you what type of light, what type of water. Okay, so Pam asked, what do I think of using a daily misting? Oh, that with orchid food. Okay. Yes, it works. That's something, orchids, like most plants, can absorb water and nutrients through their leaves. And the only thing you have to watch for is that will leave eventually that will leave salt residue on the leaf. Your leaves, excuse me, are gonna look like they're getting grainy little things on them. Won't hurt them. But every now and then, if you're using that, what you want to do is get a warm wash rag and just wipe the leaf surface down to get the excess salt off of the outside. But they do work. That is a good option for fertilizing. Catherine asked, what is the best way to water? There's two ways that work equally as well. It depends on how easy it is for you to take things to your kitchen sink. If you have, I tend to take mine to the kitchen sink. So I will carry them over to the sink. I have well water, so I don't have to worry about the salts. I can just use them right out of the faucet. And I will just use the hose sprayer and water or pour water down through the media I let them sit in the sink for a little bit, and then I do it again. And when it's all drained out, I put them back in their saucers. Oh, I'm sorry. That's my um, the other thing you can do is you can get a bucket of water, and some people will just walk around to their orchids and dunk the pot in the water. The crown is still out of water, but dunk the pot in the water, hold it for like 30 seconds, and then put it back in. And that's another way to get water to absorb into the roots. Either one of those work well. It's just whatever's most convenient and easy for you. Eliza asks, is there a reputable source to recommend to buy? There isn't in Pennsylvania, but the name of the place where I buy mine is called Plant Delights Nursery. And let me, when I get through all of this, I will type it in if you didn't get it, but it's just Plant, Plant, Delights, Delights Nursery. They're out of North Carolina. The one thing you got to really be careful with, like if you go to eBay, they'll sell you native orchids, but these are the people that are out in the woods yanking them out of the ground. They won't live because native orchids are very closely tied to the mycorrhizal fungus in the soil. What Plant Delight's nursery does is they're allowed to buy seed pods. They grow them from seed, and they grow them not using that fungus but using fertilizer. So theirs actually can survive. If you buy the ones like that from people that are pulling them out of the ground, they won't live because you're not bringing the fungus with them. But Plant Delight's nursery, very good. That's where I bought all of mine. I know there's other ones. I've heard there's a very nice one in Michigan, Minnesota, somewhere out in the Midwest. Okay, let's see. Joe said he has or she has a keiki growing on your orchid flower saw. No, it is a sign that it's happy. Uh, that is it if it's blooming and it has a keiki, then the plant is trying to split its energy between the blooms and the keiki. If you want the keiki, if that's your thing that you're going for, it's almost best to cut the flowers off, cut the stem above the keiki, so that the plant can put all its energy. A keiki, for anyone that doesn't know what it is a miniature, is a baby plant. It's Hawaiian for baby, and it's a way that some Phalaenopsis orchids will vegetatively propagate. On an old bud stem or on a bud stem, they will just start growing this keiki. You can't make them do it. It just kind of some genus just or some species just do it. Out of all of my Phalaenopsis I've ever had, I only had two that ever produced keikis. So my suggestion would be, if the plant is blooming and you really want that keiki to start growing and get healthy, you're going to have to cut the flowers off so that it doesn't waste the energy on the flowers. It puts it into the baby. And you leave them on until the leaves and the roots are about an inch to 2 inches long, and you want four. You want four leaves, you want four roots. And then you can cut them off and put it in another pot, and they should be fine. Yes, you do. Thank you for asking that, Jane. You do water as soon as you repot because the media is going to be dry and you don't want the media sucking the water out of the plant roots. So definitely water as soon as you repot. What makes a good media? Nancy asked. Um, a good media, and it depends on the genus, but a good media is going to have some organic matter and some inorganic matter. So when you buy, and it doesn't have to be expensive, but when you buy, even at Lowe's, buy a Phalaenopsis, a bag of that media, it'll have pine bark in it or bark in it. It'll have perlite. It'll have some rocks. So the bark is going to absorb the water and hang on to it, and the other things won't break down as fast as the bark will, and they provide the air for the to keep the roots healthy. So you as long as you're getting an orchid media, that should work. And you can, I've used the Lowe's stuff for my Phalaenopsis and it works fine. Tiny orchids. No, if you have either a miniature variety, I'm sorry, no, the care is not the same. Well, it is, but you're going to find that you need to water more. If you've got a miniature or a seedling or something that's small, it's going to need more moisture until it gets big enough to store its own. It doesn't have a lot of roots. It doesn't have a lot of leaves. It can't store its own moisture. So the way you do that is they usually wrap those in sphagnum moss, because that'll hold a lot of moisture for you. So if you've got something tiny like that, um, I would check the roots, but as long as the roots look healthy, you're going to need to give that more water. You don't need to mist it, but you're going to need to give it more water than your bigger ones that are able to store water for themselves. Katie, if I were to grow orchids in a nursing home, um, yes. Well, you know what? I don't know about people ingesting them. I know that they're not toxic to cats. My daughter-in-law's a veterinarian. So I've been told that her cat, they're not toxic to cats. So I, I don't honestly, I've never read anything on if humans eat them. Some orchids, they actually are edible, like the dendrobium orchid flowers are edible.
Yeah, so
The
maybe the
tubers and the roots are edible.
flower, because I've known that the flowers to be, but I don't know that that's for all orchids. I just didn't know about the rest of the plant, so I thought maybe you'd know. That's all.
No, unfortunately, that you're the first person to ask me that question.
Okay.
I I apologize that I can't give you that answer, but I'm sure it's out there somewhere. If you ask, if you know like which orchid you're going to take, I would specifically ask like are Phalaenopsis orchids dangerous if they're ingested?
Okay,
Um, but
thanks.
thank you for asking it. I'm going to have to go look that up now.
All right,
Oh,
thanks.
thank you. Leanne put in Plants Delights Nursery. Kathy, do you cut off the long stems? Uh, it depends on if they're green or dead. So a Phalaenopsis orchid will put the great big long stem out with all the flowers at the end. Sometimes what it does is it when the flowers all die and fall off is just the top part of it'll die, but the rest of it'll stay green. uh, Cut off the dead part, cut off the part that's gone brown and leave the green part. Sometimes it'll kick out a side shoot and you'll get a few extra flowers off the side shoot. But if the whole stem dies, then just cut it off at the bottom. Uh, Oh, good. Okay, so if you don't have any flowers, Joe said, and just the keiki, uh, it may just take it time. You may want just make sure you're giving it enough water because again, it's making that plant material. So you're giving it enough water, you're fertilizing it, and it should start growing. It's a very slow process. Aerial roots, Carrie asked. No, you do not have to put aerial roots in the pot. And as a matter of fact, it'll probably just grow more even if you do. Remember, those are the things that were attaching it to the tree. Some orchids just look like a bad hair day. I mean, there's just aerial roots coming out of them all over. And you don't want to cut them off because they're going to store energy and they're going to store nutrients and water. And you don't have to get them in the potting soil. They'd be out in the air in nature. What do you do? Okay, same thing. Mary asked. You just let them go. If the roots come through the pot, okay, a plastic pot, and then to the outside, when you repot it, you're probably going to rip them off. But it doesn't matter if it's that healthy that it's doing that. It's going to have more than enough roots, but you don't have to force those roots inside. Uh, yes, there are nearly 60 species, and there's a lot of native orchids. So I think I hit them all. I've been wanted to try to get through all these. Thank you again. I really appreciate it. And my email's here. I do answer emails. So if you have a question, please send me an email.
Thank you, Barb, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Yep.
We've got Barb's email there, and continuing education is open for questions as well.
Okay. Oh, we did get something here. Thank you, Rebecca. Said that yes, some orchids can cause a problem. So that's interesting to know. I did not know that. So thank you very much for asking the question and looking it up. I think that's, if there's nothing else, then I would hope you all have a wonderful night. And again, I will keep watching my email if any of you have any other questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night, all.
Night.